Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third and final Sulgrave Seminar of the 2023-24 series. My name is Dr. Sam Edwards, and it's my absolute pleasure to host this afternoon's proceedings. The Sulgrave Seminar Series is brought to you by Sulgrave Manor, the ancestral home of George Washington, first President of the United States, and as such, it is the original home of the US-UK special relationship. And our seminar series reflects this fact. Each seminar this year has explored some of the connections and contrasts in US and UK history, culture, and politics. And this year, the theme for our series has been that of democracy. Our first seminar back in November, which you can still watch on YouTube, focused on US and UK constitutions. Our second seminar in April turned its attention to US and UK electoral politics. Our third seminar today explores the role of political leadership, focusing in particular on some of the partnerships and occasional disagreements between US presidents and UK prime ministers. To examine this subject, it's our delight to have with us Professor Michael Cullinane, the Lowman Walton Chair of Theodore Roosevelt Studies at Dickinson State University in North Dakota. Professor Cullinane is a recognized authority on the history of the US presidency, on US foreign policy, on US diplomacy, and also on Anglo-American relations. He has written a number of works about the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, and of particular interest, given our subject today, he is co-editor of a 2021 collection examining the fascinating history of presidents and prime ministers from Cleveland and Salisbury to Trump and Johnson. Notably, Professor Cullinane has also written about the origins of Sulgrave Manor itself as a memorial to peace between the English-speaking peoples. And you can find his work on this subject in the journal Peace and Change. And if you enjoy what Professor Cullinane has to say this afternoon, then check out as well his fantastic podcast, The Gilded Age and Progressive Era, which is available on all good podcast platforms. Those of you who have joined one of these seminars before knows the score, but to be clear, each seminar follows the same basic format. Our speaker will deliver a short presentation offering their thoughts on the subject of the day, and today that is the role of presidents and prime ministers as the linchpin of the special relationship. Professor Cullinane and I will then discuss further some of the points he raises, some of the issues he addresses, but we're also absolutely keen that it isn't just about us. I want to get your thoughts, your questions, your comments. So if there's something you want to ask about US and UK special relationship, about presidents and prime ministers, then this afternoon is the occasion to do so, and you can make use of the question and answer function on your screen to ask us a question. Without further ado, then, I'll hand over to our speaker, Professor Michael Cullinane. Mike, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Sam, very much. And it's always such a pleasure to see you. I'm delighted to be back at Sulgrave Manor, albeit virtually. Been a long time since I've had the pleasure of being at Sulgrave, and I was talking to Sam earlier about the last time I was there. I actually got to sleep over in the house, which is a pleasure. I understand Sam hasn't had, or maybe I haven't really told him about the scars of that sleepless night and the haunting ghost of George Washington that still comes into my dreams. And if anyone has questions about where I slept, where George Washington slept was a big deal in the US, but I slept at Sulgrave. If anyone has any questions about that experience, I'd be happy to talk about that as much as presidents and prime ministers. Sam also kindly pointed out that my colleague Martin Farr and I, we finished a book a couple of years ago about the pairings of presidents and prime ministers since Grover Cleveland and Lord Salisbury back in the 19th century, all the way up to today, or at least we thought it was today. We thought we would be able to reliably say that Boris Johnson would be in office for a little bit longer, and we had no idea that Liz Truss was going to last not quite as long as lettuce, and then that Rishi Sunak and then perhaps another prime minister will be in 10 Downing Street in just 3 or 4 days. So it's remarkable to look at presidents and prime ministers as a pairing across this time period, though, and we've had a good run so far from basically 1895 all the way up to 2020, 2021. And this offers us a lot of really interesting conclusions. But before we do that, I want to go back to 1945 when Winston Churchill first referred to the United States and the United Kingdom as having a special relationship. So Churchill said that after his wartime ally, Franklin Roosevelt, had died, and it was in his eulogy that Churchill declared, Franklin Roosevelt in there died the greatest American friend we have ever known, and the greatest champion of freedom who's ever brought help and comfort from the new world to the old. And that sort of has been the thing that resonates with most people about Churchill and Roosevelt, this enduring relationship between these two men. And that memorial, what it really did was it helped shroud the differences between the two people. And one of the things I'd like to talk a little bit today is about the reality of the relationship and then the perception of the relationship, because Churchill sought to project a sense of that personal relationship as being the peak of transatlantic rapport and really the template for relations between the United States and the United Kingdom. And part of that is true. The U.S. and the U.K. did forge an alliance during World War II that was built on a sense of national camaraderie and an idea, we could say a shared mission, whether it's the mission to defeat fascism around the world, or the idea that underlied the earlier relations, like the idea that the English-speaking people had a kindred spirit and a common goal. So Roosevelt and Churchill exemplify that, and they exemplify that specialness of the Anglo-American relationship. And part of that derived simply from those two men. We know that it doesn't all derive from those two men, but in the book about pairings, we argue that the special relationship that preceded World War II and has endured beyond it really comes from a bond that the president and the prime minister make or don't make. And that's to say that sometimes the relationship isn't special. I think David Cameron called it essential, which was sort of like papering over some cracks at the time. But ultimately, the bottom line we argue is that these personal relationships matter. And let me give you another example. So John Major, when George H.W. Bush was running for re-election in 1992, John Major really did very little to hide the fact that he wanted Bush reelected as president. And as we know, Bush lost to Bill Clinton in that election. And at that point, the special relationship looked like it could be not in danger, but I suppose this pairing wasn't the strongest. And then the precipitous decline did come when John Major refused to speak with Bill Clinton for 4 weeks in 1994. That was when Bill Clinton issued a visa for the Sinn Féin leader, Gerry Adams. And so what that dispute revealed was how frosty the bond between a president and a prime minister can get, and how those clashes can give rise to a sense of contrasting ambitions, or maybe something even worse. It could reveal fractures in the Anglo-American relationship. So in short, amity among leaders bears promise for the relationship, and ill will signifies discord. So if the rocky personal relationship of Clinton and Major are the low and Churchill and Roosevelt are the high, one thing that doesn't change with these personal relationships is the longstanding military, intelligence, diplomatic, and economic cooperation between the two nations. That's what we might call the institutional relationship. And in the case of Major and Clinton, that transcended any personal dislike they had for each other. Now, we've long queried the effect of personal relations on statecraft. Like, that's been a sort of underlying theme of many of the books that you read about diplomacy. How much do people matter? How much does that institutional relationship matter? On the one hand, people put a value on systems and circumstances, or context and the material interests of nations and states, their institutions, the security systems, and certainly on non-governmental commercial activity. For others, the circumstances of global politics derive from human agency. And I have to say, I'm in that camp. The personal and emotional connections that diplomats make with other diplomats, I think, define foreign relations. Not exclusively, but I think they certainly are a part of it. And in the study of Anglo-American relations, this is very much an ongoing debate, even if we analyze relationships like that one between Churchill and Roosevelt, that ostensibly we can say are the zenith, the apex, the high point of the special relationship. Did these leaders catalyze the special relationship because the survival of the Anglo-American way of life depended on it, or did their personal relationship make the wartime alliance and craft that shared ideology? Like, in a lot of ways, I put this down to what came first, the chicken or the egg? And there's no right answers. So when we get to the questions, feel free, to take your stand on this point. But just know that I don't believe there's any right answers to the question. And getting to the bottom of the historical riddle that is the chicken or the egg, or the human agency versus the institutional agency, if it is impossible, well, let's say it isn't impossible. If it's not impossible, it might just lead to the interpretation that it's somewhere between the two. which is fair enough too. And investigating the personal affairs of presidents and prime ministers at least gets us a little bit closer to a fuller picture by recognizing that there are other factors at play here. There is the strategic context, there is geopolitics, there is national security and economic interests, but there are also the power brokers, and the individual associations that they make can be very powerful. So if we're talking about reality and perspective here, there's another player in the mix. There's kind of like, we've got our protagonist, we've got our antagonist, and now I'm just going to throw the dynamite into the middle here, and that is the media. So the media, regardless of whether you think it's fake news or not, the media adds a variable when we assess the personal relations of a president and a prime minister. They really help to shape the appearance of that relationship. And again, Churchill and Roosevelt, they set that high watermark for harmony because they presented, and they were so successful in presenting, the image of like-minded allies who really, the media obscured the differences and the changing nature of their personal relationship. If we look at the time of Roosevelt's death in 1945, he had gravitated so far away from Churchill on so many issues and toward Joseph Stalin on many issues. Personal relations between Churchill and Roosevelt suffered badly since 1944, really. And as a consequence, did the special relationship suffer? I don't think it did. But outwardly, Churchill and Roosevelt never depicted their relationship as one that had deteriorated. They had instead conjured that image of an inseparable coalition between nations and president and prime minister. And their speeches intone narratives, again, of that kindred peoples and those shared values. And that's really important. Now, in other cases, the public image and the underlying realities can prove even more difficult to understand. And I'd like to use a modern example for this. In January of 2017, most of us will remember when Prime Minister Theresa May visited the White House. This was just shortly after Donald Trump was inaugurated. And she congratulated him on the 2016 election. Really, what she was there to do was to push for new trade deals, because, of course, Brexit was getting done, I guess. And so she was looking for trade deals after the referendum. And she also sought to enhance existing security commitments, as well as reaffirming the special relationship, which is what every prime minister attempts to do straight after taking office. But these policy matters vanished almost immediately when the media, captured that image of Trump grabbing Theresa May's hand as he was walking outside the colonnades of the West Wing. And the public interest in that handholding seemed to overshadow all other details of Theresa May's trip. All of the editorials for the week were commenting on or speculating on the gesture's meaning, wondering if these two had a personal fondness, and if that personal fondness had symbolized the ambitions of their countries. But less obvious in these photos were all the ways that Trump had frustrated British efforts at a closer relationship with Britain. His administration threatened tariffs and eventually followed through on some of those. His unorthodox opinions on Brexit were infuriating to some, as were his comments about knife crime in London. And his support for a conspiracy theory effectively accused the UK of spying on Americans. And that last bit broke the central tenet of the special relationship since 1945, which is you don't undermine the intelligence pact between the two countries. But still, what endures is that image of those two leaders holding hands. That became the emblematic feature of the May-Trump relationship, and it remained so iconic that a year later, they repeated the scene when Trump came to the United Kingdom. I forget where they were. It might have been Chequers, where they held hands again in a nod to that gesture. So whether a president and a prime minister are cordial or not, and whether their image is real or exaggerated, there can be really no denying that the relationship, it matters. And the aim of this research that was done between Martin and me and 20 other contributors in this book is to emphasize that personal relationships have a bearing on the transatlantic world. And in some instances, and I do believe this, on the global order. If we track back to the 1890s, when this book begins, and when the United States and the British Empire began what was called by Bradford Perkins the Great Rapprochement, or the great coming together of the two countries, sort of burying the hatchet, it's there, I think, that we see the wellspring of the special relationship. And arguably, we could even go back to 1814 and 1815, to the last time the two countries went to war and the signing of treaties that forbid war along the Canadian border. And maybe that's something we might want to discuss in the Q&A. When does the special relationship come into existence? But certainly from the late 19th century, or at least from 1896, which is the Venezuela crisis, which again we could discuss because this is now a crisis in the 21st century. Venezuela is bickering with Guyana over territory that is rich in natural resources, and that was the fight back in 1896. But if we go back that far to that time when Grover Cleveland was president and Lord Salisbury was the prime minister, since then to today, I don't think there's any personal relationship that has proven to be more important to international relations than that of the president and the prime minister. And as leaders of their respective nations, that personal relationship has taken on great significance for policy. The long history of the special relationship before and beyond World War II allows for an expansive view and a sense of the changing nature of the offices of president and prime minister. In the late 19th century, when the British commanded an expansive empire, the United States was certainly a junior partner, even a subordinate. But two world wars transformed the United States into an undisputed global leader that outranked even the United Kingdom, at least in terms of military and economic might. The dynamics of the Anglo-American relationship changed. And with them, the dynamics between the president and the prime minister changed. And looking at those changes, so one of the things we talk a lot about in Anglo-American relations, probably to the point of exhaustion, is when does the United States sort of like supersede the United Kingdom as a global superpower? And people will argue that it's around World War I. I've listened to Kathy Burke say absolutely not. It's 1945, and I've heard other people say other things in the 1890s perhaps. But really, what we can see in the relationship of the president and the prime minister is where that begins to change. If not, it's not an overnight thing that happens, but before becomes president, he's quite deferential to Theodore Roosevelt and even as foreign minister later on during World War II, he's quite deferential to the Americans. So it's not just about, much more about, I'll say that again. The personal relations between the president and the prime minister divulge more than a general assessment, though, of power dynamics, because presidents and prime ministers rarely enjoy overlapping tenures. And what I mean by that is that often a president the term will run longer than a prime minister's or vice versa. And because of that, their rapport can indicate where the ideological winds are blowing at a given time. Although at the moment, it seems quite different. It seems in America, the ideological winds are moving maybe to the right, and in the UK, they are moving to the left. But that tells us something as well. We could look back to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They're often associated together as crusading conservatives. But if you look at Margaret Thatcher's terms in office, she takes the keys of Downing Street when Jimmy Carter is president, and she doesn't leave until George H.W. Bush was in office. And you have to ask yourself, in those years, did nothing change? Is the narrative that simple, that there was a conservative impulse in the United States and the UK? I mean, I think there is, but I don't think it's quite as neat as those personal terms or Reagan's term in office and then Thatcher's overlapping it. And if we go back further, we see the same. So, for example, Warren G. Harding, who I know is everyone's favorite president, he corresponded with 4 prime ministers over a truncated third term, right? He dies in office. He wrote to David Lloyd George, Andrew Bonar Law, Stanley Baldwin, and Ramsay MacDonald. And what's even more interesting, if we think about those 4 characters, is that's a liberal, 2 conservatives, and the very first Labor prime minister. So there's quite a bit going on there to unpack. And the variations in the bonhomie between presidents or prime ministers, or the lack thereof, gives us a greater sense of how they operate as diplomats. We can draw distinctions between political views and leadership styles. So Clinton, I've already mentioned, he had a poor relationship with John Major. You can contrast that with a rather chummy relationship with Tony Blair. But then why and how could Tony Blair move so seamlessly from a relationship with the Democrat Bill Clinton, who he seemed to have like a natural affinity with, to an equal closeness, which he did have indeed with George W. Bush, who was a conservative Republican? And Churchill served non-consecutive terms as prime minister, just to complicate things even further. How did his statecraft differ between Roosevelt and Eisenhower? And personal relations can tell us about domestic politics and how heavy they weigh upon foreign policy and the formulations of foreign policies. Do leaders get along any better when they come from the same political background? I don't know. I think that's up for debate. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were certainly cut from the same ideological cloth, but does that alone explain their connection? Barack Obama and Gordon Brown are cut from the same ideological cloth. Center-left leaders, they did not get along. They never hit it off at all. So maybe we can attribute personal camaraderie with times of crisis and challenges that face the two countries, because that is certainly the case with some of them. If we think about Woodrow Wilson and David Lloyd George, these two people did not like each other. They did not get on politically, and yet they faced the emergency of the First World War and spoke quite kindly about one another, at least publicly. So I think context necessarily shapes personal relationships, and those connections, however negligible they might be, affect Anglo-American relations more broadly. And occasionally, a personal rapport between a president and a prime minister can have even broader implications. In fact, what we argue in the book about presidents and prime ministers is that the pairing can directly affect geopolitics, commerce, peace and security, global culture, and human rights. In short, we make a very clear case for why people matter. Institutions, systems, heritage, tradition are not ignored in the book, but these two leaders have a disproportionate impact on global policy and foreign relations, period. So that idea is sometimes unfashionable, I think, because we often think in terms of systems, ideas, ideologies perhaps, but putting responsibility squarely on the personalities and the individuals that take the reins of leadership is correct. They are at the forefront of transatlantic relations and should be at the forefront, I think, of our histories as well. And I'd like to emphasize that personal relations do not preclude leaders who never met. In fact, at least a third, maybe a half of this book deals with presidents and prime ministers that never met each other. Grover Cleveland and Lord Salisbury never did. Neither did Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover meet any of their British counterparts. Theodore Roosevelt and Arthur Balfour never met while they were in office, only after they had left office. And even without that face-to-face contact, these presidents and prime ministers established a meaningful relationship. In some cases, they developed very strong feelings about the other, about their partner. Now, obviously, with the advent of aviation and telecommunications, presidents and prime ministers meet up now. It's really since the 1940s that personal touch is very much a part of diplomacy. The distinction, though, might offer us some insights into how the relationship works. If we think about the pandemic, for example, Boris Johnson only met Trump and Biden a handful of times he was prime minister for about 3 years, right? Maybe a little bit more. Liz Truss managed to meet Biden 2 times in a month. So does that matter? And I think in some cases it might. In others, I think in the case of Truss, I don't think it mattered at all. These were ceremonial meetings. So what are the meetings that matter? Are they just the meetings in which we see the state visits in which Trump and May are holding hands, or are there summits that matter? Are there the Camp David meetings? Which ones are the ones that matter most for the relationship? More than a century of history proves that personal relationships matter at every level. And regardless of who occupies the White House or Downing Street, it's people that make policy. Common interests and values keep the US and the UK close, which is, I think, a truism that contrasts with the less predictable accord between presidents and prime ministers. The relationship among policymakers highlights power dynamics and fault lines. Regardless of how staged and choreographed these meetings might be, they provide opportunities for exchange They cement shaky relationships, they spark crises, they weaken strong bonds, they develop our national interests, they set our geopolitical circumstances. They're important, and no two leaders are more important than the president and prime minister. Now, controversially, I'd like to turn to our current context. And I say controversially because you're all very familiar with the United States, and things are rather divided there. It's been a long time that things have been divided. Perhaps not the worst division in our history, but it is rather divided. I'd like to just speculate about what this means for the Anglo-American relationship. I can, again, though, reaffirm that I think that the people that matter, the president that gets elected in November, the prime minister that gets elected in 3 days, is going to be, it's going to matter. And so I think the best way to talk about this is through the security situation, because this is where the bonds of the United States and the UK are perhaps at their greatest. So right now, I think the United States, and this is me speaking, not any of my affiliated organizations, but the United States and the United Kingdom, they face a common foe today. Vladimir Putin is on a collision course with other countries. He's already invaded Ukraine, and he's weaponized natural resources like petroleum. Xi Jinping has publicly said that before he leaves office, he will retake Taiwan. And both of these countries threaten the Anglo-American political order, one that abides by the rule of law, democracy, and international covenants that are against military aggression. The United States and the United Kingdom each face their own domestic threats, be they terrorists that attacked the Capitol on January 6th, or populists that have come to prominence after the 2008 financial crisis. And here I'm talking about extremists in all political parties, but specifically I want to talk about those on the right in the United States, because they are the ones that have occasionally controlled the reins of power in Washington. Perhaps you could argue Westminster as well. As for the left, the one thing you could say about Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders is that they've always been in opposition, or they've failed to become the heads of government. Now, the same can't be said for Donald Trump, who president for 4 years and very well may be president for another 4 years beginning in 2025. And I don't think I'm saying this, this is not a political statement, but Donald Trump is far removed from the American political tradition. He doesn't resemble past presidents. And I would contend that in some ways, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss don't resemble typical prime ministers either. Liz Truss moved the economic dial so far to the right that the UK bond market nearly imploded. And so our countries face a lot of the same issues. We have some of the same leadership struggles. I think we also face some of the same, what people call culture wars, which threaten to upend our understanding of ourselves and deny any sense of common truth within and beyond our nations. Our enemies, however, have remained very much the same. Autocrats, tyrants, thieves, knaves. They are probably as dangerous, if not more dangerous, now than they were in the Cold War or the World Wars. Are we more or less unified than we were then? These are questions that have really meaningful implications for the special relationship, and that I think I'd love to hear feedback on. There are signs that we still retain a common goal, though. If we look at the UK, Australia, United States trilateral security pact between those three countries, that reaffirms the special relationship, in the very least in a military way, and intelligence as well. The West has also remained remarkably unified on Ukraine, if not slow at getting arms and money to the Ukrainians. That has been a deterrent to Xi Jinping and his ambitions to conquer Taiwan. And I think we are purging domestic terrorists in the United States, although the Supreme Court recently ruled against some of the obstruction of justice charges. There are a number of convictions for January 6th extremists. And audience members may or may not agree with me, but the swift ousting of Liz Truss was a type of purge within the Conservative Party that rejected at least her economic views. How do our countries return to the socio-cultural special relationship? How do we heal the divisions within our nations? How do we reaffirm the common goals inherent within our capitalist democracies? And how do we get back to conversations that led to the foundation of places like Sulgrave Manor? Conversations about Anglo-American-led global peace and Anglo-American-led global diplomacy. For me, I believe the answer lies in the way we approach our relations with each other between the US and the UK. And here I turn to the American president I know best, Theodore Roosevelt. It's always an opportunity to come back to Theodore Roosevelt, I feel. But for those of you that are more familiar with Franklin Roosevelt was TR's younger cousin. Franklin Roosevelt was younger. TR came before FDR. He was the forebearer. I could rattle on about TR endlessly, and hopefully there'll be some questions about him. And perhaps some of you might be drawn to him as much as I am. I'm most drawn to a speech that he makes in Paris at the Sorbonne in 1910. The speech is best known for a very small, about 50-word paragraph in which he speaks about the so-called man in the arena, which I could happily dissect for you in greater depth. Sports people quote from this all the time. In fact, Gareth Southgate, who I can't believe he pulled that out of the bag last night, but Gareth Southgate regularly quotes from TR and from this passage, "The Man in the Arena." This is what he normally quotes. I'll read it in a second, but the real meaning of the speech is akin to what JFK said in 1960 at his first inaugural, when he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you." What Roosevelt is trying to address in the Sorbonne speech is the responsibilities that come with citizenship. And it really is a dire warning to Europeans and American. Pollution threatens incessantly. Democracy requires vigilance and more. Leaders, Roosevelt said, can sustain democracy or they can provoke a crisis. And he called for citizens to work together to bring about social justice. Ultimately, Roosevelt was arguing for equality. That's the goal of democracy. It's the counterbalance to the of the Man in the Arena speech to South Africa's rugby captain Francois Pienaar before the 1995 World Cup. You might know this episode as the Invictus poem, right? Because that's what the film is about. Mandela gives Pienaar this poem by a British poet. It wasn't. It was Hollywood's reinterpretation. It was Theodore Roosevelt's speech, not a British poem. So creative license wins out again. But in reality, what Mandela was saying is that this is the promise of democracy, citizenship, and one person, one vote. So in Paris, Roosevelt's speech hailed the heroes of a republic who go to work every day, pointing out that some of the most important work that is done is non-remunerative, which is caring for children, voluntary activism, charity, helping a neighbor, other similar acts, which are the greatest contributions to the health of the republic and to the vitality of democracy more broadly. And you can scale this to the national, to the international. Looking after your neighbors is the UK-US relationship, taking care of each other. The famous line from his speech goes like this: "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better." And sports people and broadcasters love that point. But Roosevelt, what he was talking about was the critic, really. Who is the critic, according to Roosevelt? It's the person who expresses contempt for other citizens of the republic. What he really meant was, beware the demagogue who breeds factions among us. So as we think about the Anglo-American relationship and the importance of individuals who shape it, I think it would serve us well to think of Roosevelt's speech, because it provides a lesson on the strengths of our democracy, our place in the world, and the values that I think we hold dear. I think it also points out aptly where all of the threats exist. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Mike. Thanks so much for that presentation there. A powerful statement on the importance of human agency, of people, of personality, and that we need to look beyond just the institutional kind of structures, and that special relationship, Anglo-American relations, is also about people as well. If you've got questions, then now is the time to throw those into the Q&A function on your screen. As you are thinking and as you are putting your fingers to the keyboard, though, I'm going to kick things off here. Mike, you were talking there about about Churchill and FDR in the 1940s, kind of the high watermark in some respects, and then I think you mentioned Clinton, Bill Clinton, and John Major in the 90s as something of a low point in terms of the personal dynamic. Can I invite you to go back even further? Is there anyone in the earlier partnerships, kind of early 20th century, that gets anywhere close to the Churchill FDR relationship, or is that just so different and so distinct?
I think it's really distinct. I think even presidents and prime ministers that get along well, if you take Wilson and David Lloyd George, that's probably as close as it's going to get in terms of major global crisis. The United States is late to the party again, and they do have a common goal in the sense of they can both agree that a League for Peace, or a League of Nations, as it is eventually called, is a good idea. But Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson, they disagree on so much, like the blockade and British Navy and what a real alliance should look like, what a real military alliance should look like. Wilson didn't want anything akin to what Roosevelt and Churchill eventually agreed to in a post-war military alliance. So I don't think there is. I mean, there's a reason why World War II is such a turning point for our nations and our special relationship. And I think that's perhaps where you could say the special relationship is particularly special after 1945. But there are elements of that shared, I suppose, heritage and tradition. Arthur Balfour and Theodore Roosevelt have it. They talk often about the shared cultural references, the shared language. Even though Roosevelt is not English, he's Dutch, by birth. So he doesn't talk in the same terms about ethnicity. They talk in the same terms of an English tradition, an English language tradition, and what that brings. So the short answer is there really isn't anything like Churchill and FDR. But then Churchill and FDR aren't everything we think that is either. I mean, it's really a rather disgruntled relationship for Churchill in a lot of ways after 1945. So none of these relationships are the same. And that's one of the fun things about it as well. And I don't think our national relationships are ever the same at any given point.
A really interesting point you were making as well, but it's got the role of media and how depictions of the partnership matter. But before we get to that, just on the theme that we're running with here for a moment. So Churchill and FDR there in the 1940s, clearly a very close connection there and rapport. When you look at then the second half of the 20th century, do you think there are any PM president partnerships which get close, which get almost there, or is it just so very, again, distinct?
So Jack and Mac are probably as close as the FDR Churchill, but again, that is a perception thing. Behind the scenes, there's real fractions over missile technology, air to air and ground to air missiles, and who's going to get what, and England and Macmillan feel like they're shortchanged often. But that's a positive relationship. But again, the common foe brings that to bear as well. The Cold War, and the idea of a Soviet enemy is so tangible in 1960 that in 1961 to 63 that makes that relationship a very positive one as well. And I think that might be the thing about Tony Blair and George W. Bush. Tony Blair still believes, has never wavered in his sense that global terrorism was a threat to the world, but particularly to the Anglo-American idea of global order. And George W. Bush did too. So that's probably one of the most common themes, is that when we have a sense among the leaders, regardless of what party they're from or their ideologies, if they do have a sense of a common threat, they do come together.
On that, running with this theme just a little bit further, so a question here from Stephen, who's wondering if you've got any sort of further reflections on the role of just the encounter of presidents and prime ministers actually meeting each other, and the significance of that, and the fact, of course, that as you said in your presentation there, becomes far more possible as we work our way through the second half of the 20th century. So personal encounters matter, yeah?
I think they do, but I don't want to say that's the be all and end all, because I think these relationships, they happened even when they didn't meet. So, I mean, Lord Salisbury had very strong feelings about Grover Cleveland. I mean, he thought, the Americans were, at best junior partners, not really partners at all. I mean, he didn't have it was his nephew, Arthur Balfour, that really moved him to adopt a more pro-American stance, So, but they do matter. The personal relationships matter. These meetings do matter. The opportunity to spend time with one another. I mean, we know this now. I mean, the pandemic years have shown us that we can Zoom and we can do these sort of, lectures and talks, and they're great. But if I was there tonight, shaking everyone's hand and having a glass of wine, it would be a different thing. And so I don't think we can dispute that. However, because these relationships matter, they're going to get on, even if they can't be in person with one another. And so I think that's what you see, is that ultimately they get on. I think Stephen's other question is it about Biden stepping down and how they get chosen? Is that?
That's the one. Yeah. Is there any significance in just how people are selected, how they get to be president, how they get to PM? Does that factor in?
I think so. I think if you look at Rishi Sunak, we've got a really good contemporary example there, because the voters of the Conservative Party rejected Sunak as their leader. It's almost akin to the American primary system. And 90% of the presidents covered in the book were primaried. So from Wilson on, they're all primaried. So there is a sort of grassroots, but there's also a party level sort of decision that goes on too. I mean, we saw that with Barack Obama's victory. We saw that with with Trump's victory too. There's a party level decision that has to happen before a president can become the nominee for a party. So it's interesting now that Biden is being. I mean, the New York Times published their editorial yesterday about Biden should step down and the party should have an open. Bill Maher wrote today that the party should have an open convention in which effectively the grassroots gets to primary them. And I think that's a part of democracy. That's something that we share in common. I don't think it operates in quite the same way, because there is not a national election for a prime minister, right? But it still does happen in a sense. I mean, you know that you're voting for Keir Starmer for prime minister if you vote Labor this year. So I think it's very similar, although this year, if Biden does step down, I think this will be the most unusual convention since probably 1968, which is a long time ago if you think about it.
On this subject of, we can't help but think ourselves forward to a degree. There's a UK election coming up, and obviously an election stateside as well come November. So, questions over what might the special relationship look like in the future? What might that President Prime Minister partnership look like? So, I just want to follow up on something you mentioned there in your presentation about the role of political allegiance around party affiliation. Does it matter which party each person is representing? Is it more likely that a Conservative and Republican get on, and is it more likely that a Labour and Democrat figures get on, or, as you were saying in your presentation, is it more sort of complicated than that?
Well, I think it's more complicated. Sometimes it does matter. I think Ronald Reagan and Theresa May are probably the high watermark of ideological camaraderie. You would have thought Gordon Brown, though, and Barack Obama would have been, best mates, but that doesn't happen. So and if you look at John F. Kennedy and Harold Macmillan, they're not from the same political, but they got on really well. So it's really hard to say. I think the context matters immensely. The person matters immensely, and that's kind of what I've been unfortunately harping on about the whole time, is that it's both of these things that that matter, and it's hard to tell. I mean, if we have a Trump and Keir Starmer pairing, beginning in November or January, I should say, what does that mean? I'm not sure. I'm not sure it matters. If there's a crisis at hand and Trump and Starmer both believe that crisis is existential, I think they're going to be an amazing pairing. I think the likelihood of that is pretty slim. I don't think we're facing yet that sort of that peril. And as a result, there's going to be politics that are played. I mean, Starmer's not going to want to. I wouldn't think Starmer would want to appear as a warm and cozy friend of Donald Trump because of their political differences. But circumstances could change all that.
Do you think does biography matter? Does kind of personal biography, but it's kind of who people are and where they're coming from? So I'm thinking here, much was made after the First World War, the fact that Woodrow Wilson's mother was from Northern England. Harold Macmillan, JFK. There's a cousin connection there. There's a distant family connection. Bill Clinton, Rhodes Scholar, Donald Trump as well. I think the first American president since Wilson whose mother was British. Do those kind of details of biography, of background, do they factor in as well? Do they matter?
Yeah, I think they do in certain cases. I mean, Woodrow Wilson certainly had a fondness for Britain because of his personal background. It does matter. I mean, class matters, I think, as well. Mm-hmm. I think that someone like Bill Clinton, he had a you know, less wealthy upbringing than the likes of Donald Trump. That's had an effect on how he views Tony Blair. I think, I think that race actually matters quite a bit. I think Barack Obama was quite cool with Cameron, and I'm not putting that down to race necessarily. I think I would put it down to experience and a sense of class, perhaps. The other thing is that on the flip side of that, since the 1950s, really, it does seem that prime ministers have been genuflecting more to American presidents than the other way around. Presidents seem to have no problem saying, yeah, there's this special relationship. Yeah, it's fine. Let's do our handshake and get it over with. Whereas prime ministers are pitching themselves. The power dynamics between the two have changed to the point where if it's good for elections in America, they'll do it. But it's not a strategic imperative. Whereas I think for the British Prime Minister, it is a strategic imperative to be seen with the president, to be seen on side, to be getting concessions from the United States. I mean, you can see this maybe with Joe Biden, perhaps best. He's kind of tossed around the special relationship as less significant than his Irish roots. Like going back to your question about does it matter if they have a connection? He said something to the BBC about, oh, I'm Irish. I know all about Anglo-American relations. Yeah. So it does matter, and it's certainly something that but again, for me, it just doesn't necessarily feed into the context and the circumstances as much.
And when you and your co-editor and the other contributors to the book, when you were looking at this kind of long history, and you touched on this in the presentation as well, is there like a moment where you can start to see that shift that you've just described there, the kind of the impetus coming from British prime ministers to make sure they have the photo opportunities? I'm seeing one of our questions here is Churchill and Eisenhower, for instance, in the 1950s. It's not that long after the war, but is it already sort of at that point that you can start seeing that shift in the dynamic?
Yeah, I think so. We talked a little bit in the book about Attlee and Truman, and there's not that sense of genuflecting during that pairing. But there is a sense with Churchill and Eisenhower that the two of them getting together is a major reminder of World War II and what they accomplished. And there's, again, not that genuflecting. There's a sort of evenness between that relationship. But of course, Suez happens not long afterwards. And that changes everything. I mean, Eden is a much different character to Churchill as well, obviously. So that Eden-Eisenhower relationship is a much different one. And you really do see the British after Suez becoming much more deferential to American politicians, even presidential candidates. So you can remember Barack Obama coming through on a European tour before he was elected president, speaking to audiences in Berlin. I'm pretty sure he stopped in London as well. He was in Egypt, I think, also. These were opportunities for world leaders to basically shake a future president's hand. And he used that opportunity to, I don't know about winning concessions, but at least, promote his agenda for global policy and global relations.
I'm just looking at another question we've got here. Inviting, is there a comparison that we might draw between 1920s and US isolationist sentiment at that point in time and the likely leftward lean of British politics in the mid-20s? Is President Trump, PM Starmer, is there a working relationship to be built there, or are there just lots of challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I like, but I'm also rather scared about the 1920s parallel. And I'll quote Twain's thing about history doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes. It is certainly rhyming really hard right now, I think. Fingers crossed we don't have a 1929 economic collapse, but certainly we haven't heard about America first and Britain first in a long time. I mean, the two countries have been focused on an internationalist agenda really since, well, before the 1920s, but they were paused until World War II in many regards, not so much Britain, but America. And I think there's the rise of populism in both of those times as well, whether we're talking about, radicals in Britain or in America. It's scary to think that might be on the rise again. It's scary to think that some people are sanguine about it because we got through it in the 1920s. We'll get through it again now. I think one of the main challenges we have in both of our countries is reminding ourselves that citizenship is a responsibility, and you guys will have an opportunity in Britain to vote in a couple of days. That's part of citizenship. It's a right as well as part of your responsibility. But I mean, the other part of that is being cognitive of the threats to democracy, and I think we were probably less cognitive of those threats in the 1920s. and we built some out of thin air. I mean, whether it's the first Red Scare, or the racism of the KKK, or the, take your pick. There's a lot of examples, but one of the major responsibilities is to look after ourselves. And my hope is that that's something that we talk more about in a rather nonpartisan way, as the way to stave off the threats to democracy.
You've spoken about the institutional structures, military intelligence sharing, and obviously you spoke as well about the importance of people and of personality. But you also rightly touched on the role that the media play in all of this as well. And I just wondered, just kind of curious here, that does 21st century communications technology and media make it really difficult to kind of cultivate, to celebrate the kind of connection that FDR and Churchill were allegedly supposed to have? Did it just make it more difficult now because the camera is ever attentive? You mentioned there the famous images of Theresa May, holding Donald Trump's hand. Does media just make it very difficult to kind of cultivate that celebratory PM president partnership in this day and age, or not?
I mean, it does. I would be less inclined to say that it wasn't the same back then. The media was different. It wasn't a 24-hour news cycle. If we go back to, say, 1896, it certainly wasn't, right? But the media was still around, and it's up to these leaders to just say the media is probably the number one thing that they need to focus on. Probably less than their base. Their base will follow what the media reports, and I don't think it was any different if we go all the way back to the foundation of the United States, when Thomas Jefferson reinvented the media and made himself president. I think Theodore Roosevelt, when he put the press office in the White House, reinvented the media and just harnessed its power. Joe Biden last Thursday did the opposite. He said, sod the media, I'm just going to say what I think as best I can. And that's the wrong approach. I mean, ultimately, presidents and prime ministers, they are the spokespeople, and they can't be, they can't be without charisma. They can't be without charm. They can't be without a stage presence. And that people might think that's unfortunate, but that is the reality. We look to these people as leaders of our country. They have to deliver a certain character, and it might be a character, might not be real, and that has been true throughout the history of that pairing. It's been true of both of our countries. I mean, Britain has as voracious a paparazzi and press as the United States does, if not more so. And so, Gareth Southgate is dealing with this. Every leader has to deal with, the perception of themselves in public. And if they're not doing that, they're failing themselves and they're failing their policies.
I think got time for just one more here. I would obviously, as other people watching would like to as well, hear more about that fantastic research trip you had at Sulgrave Manor. We'll save that for another time. I'm going to have you back at some point, Mike. But you mentioned in the course of your presentation the Theodore Roosevelt and I think the Balfour connection, right? Was the one you were talking about, the T.R. Roosevelt? Yeah, his connection with his British counterpart.
With Arthur Balfour about golf, did you say?
Yeah, did they because they met, right? They met in person at some point.
They did. They met later on. They weren't golfers. They were Balfour was a tennis player, and actually, the both of them, they shared a love of intellectual pursuits. So Balfour was big into philosophy. Roosevelt was big into natural history. They say that when they met, which was actually the first time they met was in the Guildhall in London. Roosevelt was over after his African safari, visiting European capitals, and he met Balfour and Arthur Lee, who of course was famous for checkers. Arthur Lee said that when they met, they just fizzled with chemistry, but they had really disliked each other. Actually, not Balfour. Roosevelt disliked just about every British politician that he came across, including Churchill, perhaps because they were too alike. But he didn't get on with anyone. I mean, none of the British ambassadors, except for Cecil Spring Rice, who was a buddy, but not the ambassador. And he didn't like Balfour. But when they met each other after the presidency, they got on, they played tennis. They talked about just about everything. I think they were up late one night at checkers, in fact. So yeah, that's the other thing. Perceptions change, I guess. So, and in the case of some, after they leave office, the pressures change as well. And who knows, they might become great friends in the end after all.
You've got me thinking there. We'll have to have you back at some point to talk ambassadors. If we're talking about the significance of personality and people to Anglo-American relations, maybe we should follow this up at some point and talk ambassadors. Before I let you go, Mike, just a few thank yous and a few farewells for me to pass on to everyone that's joining us today. Many thanks for joining us. Hope you found it interesting and a timely discussion given what's happening in the UK this week and also in the States in a few months' time. I hope it's provided you with some interesting and useful background on that subject of US presidents and UK prime ministers. A few thanks. First, obviously, to Professor Michael Cullinane for joining us this afternoon. Very much appreciated. Thanks as well to my colleagues at Sulgrave who have made this possible, and especially Gemma Tomalin and Alison Ray. If you would like to support Sulgrave Manor, and it is a registered charity, then there's been a QR screen on your a QR code rather on your screen at various points, and you can also find our information on ways to donate on our website. If you go to our website, you will also see some information there about our upcoming events organised at the Manor. If you're local, if you're in the UK, if you're this side of the water, then keep an eye out, especially for what's happening at Sulgrave Manor this weekend to mark American Independence Day. Finally, we hope you'll be back with us for next year for the 24-25 series of Sulgrave seminars, free and online as ever. Information, dates, details, and the theme to follow in due course. Without further ado, then, thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy your week. And Mike, thanks very much.